Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome. On today's program, the first year of Donald Trump at the presidency of the United States and how his presidency affect our countries in Latin America and the Latin American immigrants living in the U.S. with Mark Weisbrot, co-director of CEPR, the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Mark Weisbrot, a warm welcome to the program.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
Mark, what is your assessment of the first year of President Trump at the Oval Office?
Well, you know, he didn't really have any legislative accomplishments until the very end of the year, where he got the tax bill through, and that was through a lot of bargaining and bribing and giving various senators things that they even individually benefited from. But this was something that will significantly increase inequality in the United States. If you look at where the tax cut went to, 65% of the money from the tax cut went to the upper 20% of the income distribution, and 20% of it, more than 20%, went to just the top 1%. So this is something that, you know, even though most taxpayers will, almost everybody will get some kind of cut, it's pretty small at the bottom, like it's, you know, $60 for the bottom 20% will get. And this is 2018. It's distributed differently through, you know, through 20.
Senator Sanders is saying that at the end of the 10 years, like according to his figures, 66% of the middle class is going to end up paying more taxes.
Yeah, that's right. I was just looking at the first year, because we don't really know what's going to happen, you know, all the way through. The tax code can be changed with the next Congress. I mean, Trump has done very badly. They may lose, you know, the Democrats may win the Congress in
this year.
Yeah,
in the midterms elections.
That's right, and it's because he's really pretty unpopular. He's managed to survive the scandals, and oh, you mentioned, before I go to that, I think you mentioned also how it affects immigrants, Latin American immigrants. Obviously, the latest thing he did was pretty bad. That was really significant.
Absolutely, and I would like
El Salvador,
to mention to you, yeah, we're going to be discussing exactly the TPS, but Ernesto Samper, the former Secretary General of UNASUR, the United Nations for South America, that represents 70% of all Latin American population, over 400 million people. Regarding Donald Trump, and I quote his words, he said, "Latin America didn't realize that Trump is a threat for the hemisphere." What about the first year of Donald Trump regarding Latin American countries?
Yes, he has been worse than Obama. Not as much as many people would think. I mean, I think on immigration, so that's a little bit different because that's people here in the U.S., and that was pretty severe, especially the latest revocation of temporary protected status.
Called TPS for, known as TPS.
Yes, for Salvadorans living here.
200,000.
Yes, that's big, and actually that will affect the Salvadoran economy because 17% of GDP or 17% of the Salvadoran economy is remittances sent home, money sent home by Salvadoran workers abroad, most of whom, not all, but most are in the United States. And that was something, by the way, that previous administrations, including the Bush administration, used to threaten El Salvador not to elect a left government. They'd say, you know, we're going to kick people out. Not even just TPS, but just, you know, any, you know, roundup of people who are undocumented. That was a real threat because it was a threat to their economy. So they always threatened them. And they did, I think, in some elections, they influenced the outcome with that threat. So Trump just went ahead and did it. And that's pretty serious. I think in Honduras, you have another example where the U.S. government helped legitimize a fraudulent election, even when, you know, one of their closest allies, Almagro, the Secretary General of the OAS, was refusing to accept the results of that election and calling for new elections. And then the Trump administration got the Mexican government, according to Reuters, they reported that the Mexican government made a statement that was coordinated with the United States. And then the State Department is in the press the next day saying, well, the Mexican government said this, so we're going to support this election result too. But that's something people should know. I mean, this isn't just the usual allegation of fraud. You know, people all over the world claim fraud when they lose. This is a case where, you know, it's just not believable at all. The opposition was winning by 5 percentage points with the majority of the vote counted, and then they stopped reporting results for 30 hours, and then there's a total reversal. And
it was a blackout in the meantime.
Yeah, and then the government candidate pulls ahead. You know, the odds of this happening, if these were just being reported randomly and there was no cheating and the results were just coming in without any cause to select them or change them, are less than 1 in many, many, many trillions. Okay?
And in terms of the region, we're talking, he's proposing to build a wall in the border of Mexico regarding NAFTA to redefine or renegotiate NAFTA. Cubans are saying that the relations with the U.S. is going back almost to the level of the Cold War. The relentless efforts, according to many analysts, to try to oust the government of Venezuela. We're talking also that free trade policies regarding other countries in Latin America also are being reversed because of protectionism. So the region is hurting with Donald Trump in this first year?
Yeah, I'm worried about, well, there was Honduras, yeah, I'm worried about, and Venezuela, that I should mention, because that didn't really get a lot of press, because, you know, it's interesting, the hegemony of the media is so strong on Venezuela, stronger, you know, the U.S. has certain official enemies. There's Iran, there's Russia, there's North Korea, and Venezuela has been on that. I mean, that's been one of the main targets for regime change for the United States for now 18 years. And it's very interesting the way they've really achieved a greater hegemony on the media coverage of Venezuela than even Iran and Russia. For example, the Iran sanctions are still, you know, somewhat, well, first of all, you know, the international ones were lifted against Iran in terms as part of the nuclear deal, right? To you know, assure that they wouldn't be able to produce nuclear weapons. But it's still some controversy over it, and because the United States has unilateral sanctions on Iran. And this is talked about, and it's talked about in the media. And if you look at the sanctions against Venezuela, you know, these are just considered normal. And this is something that is much more serious than sanctions against Iran or the sanctions against Russia. This is something that prevents Venezuela from restructuring its debt, which would be a necessary part of any kind of economic recovery program, and something that Venezuela could certainly do if it were not for these sanctions. So this is very, very big, and the media kind of reports it in passing. It's not like you can't find this in the news, but you can't find any discussion that says that, you know, that questions whether, first of all, it's even good for Venezuelans. It's making it harder for them to get medicine and food, okay? And secondly, whether it's legal, it violates the charter of the Organization of American States to impose, and the Geneva Convention, some of the Geneva Conventions as well, because it's collective punishment. So this is illegal. It's not sanctioned by the United Nations. It's harming people in Venezuela. And yet it's just kind of accepted here. So that is, I think, really important. The other country that I'm worried about is Mexico, because they have a presidential election in July. And the Trump administration, top officials, McMaster in particular, have already said just this week that they've declared their enmity to Andrés Manuel López Obrador.
A leftist, if you want.
Yes. And they're saying that he's going to be helped by Russia, that the Russians are involved. And there was a whole slew of articles, and not one of these articles presented even one shred of evidence that Russia was in any way involved in Mexico. And this is important because you have a media near monopoly in television in Mexico. And there was even a study, a statistical study from the University of Texas at Austin in 2006 that showed that the duopoly of television there.
Televisa and Azteca.
Yes, that actually was enough to have won the election against López Obrador. So this is something where, and what did they do in that one? They said, oh, that he was basically an agent of Chavez, of course, which was also false. And so they're going to try and do that again. They're going to intervene in other ways, and they'll have a lot of media on their side to prevent people from electing a progressive candidate.
Mark, in recent days, it has been released that book called Fire and Fury, talking about the inside of the White House of Trump. According to the author, the people that are surrounding Donald Trump at the White House say that they are questioning his mental fitness. At least half of his original cabinet is gone, and also, according to the author, many of them are questioning if he's going to really end up his term. How concerned, how worrisome is to hear all that?
Well, it's not a worry if he gets impeached or somehow forced out of office. I mean, that's not a problem. I mean, he is definitely kind of the most incompetent, unstable, and unpredictable president.
He's not a stable genius?
Yeah, he says he's not a stable genius, I don't think. And he's, you know, to a lot of people, he's also an embarrassment. Of course, I think that's why you have the elite consensus against him. You have the deep state against him. That's something that, you know, a lot of media doesn't want to recognize.
Yeah, explain to our audience what it
Well, you know, every country has some kind of a deep state. I mean, all the left governments, for instance, in Latin America, when they were elected in the 21st century, they all had embassies in the U.S. that were working against them, you know, and they had other officials that were working against them at first. So they have deep states too, you know. They have the foreign policy establishment of every country develops a certain autonomy, and you know, there are various reasons for that. But the U.S. has the mother of all deep states because it's an empire. Okay, it doesn't have a deep state that cares so much about domestic politics, but on the foreign policy, and this is something that most people don't vote on, that's one reason they can get away with it. But it's so huge. You have 17 intelligence agencies, you have the Pentagon, you have the State Department, you have the foreign policy committees of Congress, you have the National Security Council. And you know, even the best president, we could elect the best president ever, and that person would have a really hard time controlling that mess. Obama couldn't even tell most of his own State Department when he was negotiating with Cuba to normalize relations. And that was something that almost the entire business class of the United States wanted, okay? And the entire elite consensus wanted it to open up Cuba. And he still had to keep it secret because there were people who could and would sabotage it. So this is what, you know, so they told Trump and Bannon early on what the limits were. The intelligence agency leaked very damaging information on Trump, and they did it he ran on a program of having the U.S. Be less of an imperial power in the world. And he actually won votes. And there are also studies showing that those were the swing voters he won, working class voters who served in the military. A lot of them were wounded, and they didn't want any more wars. And of course, he wasn't serious. The one who was serious about it was Bannon, and they got rid of him. Mainly because of that. It wasn't because of his racism that they got rid of him. They got rid of him because he was actually serious about a bunch of the promises that Trump made on not only on foreign policy, but on populist economic policies as well. So Trump ends up in this position where, you know, he's not delivering anything except this tax cut for rich people, okay, which is not what the swing voters in, you know, Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin and all these swing states voted for. So what does he have? You know, he's very vulnerable. I think the reason he's surviving as long as he has is that the leadership of the Democrats and Mueller, to a certain extent,
special prosecutor.
yeah, they're going after him on the stuff that isn't going to work. They're going after him on collusion with the Russians, okay, which they so far have no evidence of, and I don't think they're going to come up with it. And the second thing they have is obstruction of justice for his firing of the FBI director Comey. And that, I think, is, they got maybe a 20% chance of getting that. Now, you might think, well, it is kind of obvious he fired him because he didn't like what he was doing. But the problem is with that is that the law on obstruction of justice is very specific. You have to prove that he had a very specific intent to interfere with an investigation of something that he knew was actually a crime, okay? If he fired him because he thought the guy was prejudiced against him and trying to get rid of him for whatever, you know, even if he didn't do anything, which is not entirely implausible, then they can't get him for that. So right now, and I think this is a huge mistake on the part of Mueller and the Democrats. There's tons of corruption in that administration, in Trump, his family, his son-in-law. There's, you know, and they didn't want to go after that. And I think it's partly because you have corruption everywhere. And so, you know, the Democrats don't want to get him on that. They want the cheap and easy way. Get him on the Russian stuff. Because if you get him on corruption, it's going to spill over into their camp as well. Imagine you look at what happens in Latin America. Look at all the governments that have fallen because of corruption scandals. That can happen here. You could get a situation where corruption becomes this huge issue, and Democrats and Republicans alike, just like the ones that are falling because of the sexual harassment scandals. You know, you're going to have big turnover in the House partly because of that. Well, you know, the corruption could get like that. So I think that a lot of the Democratic leadership is afraid to make that the issue. And that's the issue that's going to take him down, if anything takes him down.
When we hear Donald Trump, he's saying the economy is doing great. Dow Jones, 20% increase in the last year. Everybody's happy. They're going to get, with the tax reform, more money in their pocket. Is the economy doing well, and he's the responsible for that growth? Well,
okay, that's a little more complicated because the economy is doing pretty well, and it's been growing for more than 7 years. This is one of the longest expansions in U.S. history. Of course, it started before Trump, but it has continued. The stock market is not the economy. The stock market, you know, half the country doesn't have anything at all in the stock market, even in their retirement funds. And then of the other half, most of that's concentrated in the top 10%, okay? So your average person doesn't have much of a stake in the stock market. So that's not the economy, and it's unfortunate the media often confuses it with the economy. Now, in terms of the thing I think that should be noted, though, is as unemployment continues to decline,
around 4%.
Yes, you know, the labor market is tightening, and over the last 3 years, wages have been rising, even in the bottom half of the income distribution. So it's becoming more like the second half of the 1990s, where you did have real wage growth in the bottom 20% even. So you're getting there. You didn't have much in the last year, but if you take the last couple of years as a whole, last 3 years, you had significant wage growth. It has getting down to the bottom. And so there the real question is the Federal Reserve. Is the Federal Reserve going to do what it did through most of the post-World War II expansions, cut it off and even cause a recession? Or are they going to, you know, let it continue? And that's not going to be primarily, that's not Trump's decision, although he does, you know, appoint the chair of the Federal Reserve.
We're talking about 2018 midterms elections. What could be the impact of Donald Trump at the White House on that election, and also just looking for 2020 presidential election?
Yes. Well, I think he's hurting his party a lot. And that is what I predicted when he was first elected. I mean, I said that his main legacy is going to be to hasten the demise of his party and also the decline of the U.S. empire. And so far, that is what he's been doing. And I think that you do have, I mean, if you look at the polling data right now, if the midterm elections were held today, the Democrats could very possibly take the House. You know, even they have a shot at the
Senate
as well. So yeah, that's his impact. You're going to see in the midterms a lot of Republican candidates are going to distance themselves from him, but it may not save them. Now going to 2020, a lot's going to depend on the economy, but this is quite interesting. I mean, you know, Trump is seen as so worthless by and so awful by so many people, even people who voted for him, and even people who would vote for him again. They just don't respect him, you know, as any kind of a leader. That's not to say he doesn't have a base, but it's not. It's a minority base. Okay, it's a certain group of people, and as a result, you know, even with the economy doing this well, you know, there was a Quinnipiac poll the other day. The number of people approving of the handling of the, I think it was either his handling of the economy or the economy itself, was 63%. It's the highest they've ever gotten. And yet, at the same time, the same poll showed that the Dems were going to take the House because of Trump. So you see, no matter how well the economy does, it doesn't save him. Because nobody, you know, just the majority of people don't want him there for so many reasons. And I think one reason, before we finish, I should say, is that he could very easily start a war. You know, he's threatened North Korea repeatedly, he's threatened Venezuela, he's threatened Iran, and he has a whole pile of possible wars. And I think that's somewhat deliberate. I think that he knows that, you know, since he's a genius,
a stable genius.
A stable genius. The stable genius part of him knows that this could be the only thing that would have a chance, a war, that is, a chance of saving him his presidency.
There's agreement on many analysts that it seems that there's a perverse obsession from the Donald Trumps to demolish, to just level all the legacy of President Trump. We're talking about Obamacare, the Iran arms deal, nuclear deal, the Iran's nuclear deal. Also, we're talking about the reestablishment of relations with Cuba. Is that simply just to erase his legacy, or is also an element of racism, xenophobia? He doesn't want to let anything from a black president goes into history.
I don't know that he really wants. I mean, if you look at all the issues that you just mentioned, there are very powerful interests that contribute to the Republican Party and what support he has in each of those issues. In Iran, it's clearly he's very close to the Israel lobby. I mean, he demonstrated that with his announcement on the U.S. Embassy moving to Jerusalem. Yeah, I mean, and many other things. So the Iran thing is very explainable by that.
Obamacare.
The Obamacare, that's part of what, you know, that's part of the Republican program. He has a whole base in the Republican leadership. And that was a very bad thing they included in the tax cut bill too. They got rid of the individual mandate.
We're talking about 14 million people losing health care.
Yeah. Well, they won't lose it from that, but he's undermining that system, and the governors of Republican states are doing that too.
And then the Cuba reestablishment.
Now the Cuba thing is, I think that's more the Marco Rubio, Miami Cuban right wing of the party that's driving that. And maybe the Venezuelans here too. You know, they've become an influential group, kind of like the Cubans were in the 70s. And I think they're a force as well. So I think, though, I think that I think those things are explainable without concluding that he necessarily just wants to overturn whatever Obama did.
So finally, Mark, do you think that he's going to finish his term?
I think not. I think that one way or another, one of the scandals is going to take him down, because there are so many and there's so much corruption, you know, in his career, his real estate career even, and the circle which he's surrounded by, and he's so unpopular and unliked, and and not respected by the media here at all, and a disgrace to the entire elite here, who feels aggrieved that he's representing not only their country but their empire. And for all of those reasons, I think he probably won't last.
Mark Weisbrot, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.